All right, let's jump right into this explainer and explore a truly transformative era. We're going to look at how print, cinema, and radio fiercely battled for the public's attention in 1920s Britain, and in doing so, how they ultimately shaped the modern mass media landscape we know today. It's a fascinating story of technology, culture, and intense competition.
To see how this all unfolded, we'll break it down medium by medium. The post-war print boom, cinema and American silver screens, the birth of the BBC, impartiality in a national crisis, and finally, shaping a new national culture. So, Section 1, the post-war print boom.
Newspapers were the absolute kings of mass communication back in the 1920s. Building on a trend that kicked off before 1914, readership just exploded after the war, reaching incredibly wide audiences, literally penetrating even the poorest groups in society. To put that massive growth into perspective, in 1920, only 2 papers had a circulation of around 1 million. But fast forward just 10 years, 5 different newspapers were hitting that massive scale.
Now, to capture this expanding mass market, a really stark distinction started to emerge. It was like night and day. On one side, you had the traditional quality press, clinging to these very ordered pre-1914 columns. But on the other side, you had the new, much cheaper, popular press. These papers were throwing out bigger headlines, staggered layouts, and tons of illustrations just to grab your attention on the newsstand. But hey, it wasn't just newspapers getting in on the action. Highly targeted weekly magazines were popping up everywhere, creating these flourishing, super-specific markets. We're talking women's magazines ranging from the high-end Vogue to the more affordable Women's Weekly, packed with cosmetics ads and recipes. Meanwhile, boys were eating up patriotic adventure stories in titles like The Rover, full of secret agents and sports stars. And by the 1930s, boom, colored children's comics like the Beano and the Dandy completely took over the market. Moving right along to Section 2, cinema and American silver screens. Cinema actually became the absolute most popular medium of entertainment in the 1920s, and interestingly, it played a huge role in distracting people from older, heavier vices like heavy drinking and violence. A massive reason for this success? Accessibility. And this is perfectly captured by the concept of the matinee. A matinee is simply an afternoon performance of a film or play, usually offered at a much cheaper price. We're talking about a Saturday matinee costing just 2 pence. It offered this incredibly luxurious, exotic, and comfortable escapism that pretty much anyone could afford. But what's really wild is the sheer dominance of American movies during this era. In 1925, an overwhelming 95% of all films shown in Britain were made by American companies. 95%. Even Charlie Chaplin, the great British star of silent movies, actually made his name over in the States. This total American monopoly continued until the 1927 Cinematograph Act stepped in, forcing a 7.5% quota for British-made films. This definitely helped increase British audiences, even though, if we're being honest, it sometimes resulted in lower quality films just being churned out to meet the quota. This complete Hollywood takeover fueled what we call Americanization. That's a term for the powerful impact and integration of American culture, accents, and business into another nation's society, in this case, heavily impacting traditional British identity. Now, early skeptics were sure cinema would just be a short-lived fad. They thought British audiences would absolutely hate American accents once talkies arrived with sound in 1927. But wow, were they wrong. American stars were beloved, and box office numbers just kept climbing. All right, Section 3, the birth of the BBC. While cinema was thriving purely on visual entertainment, a totally different philosophy was brewing over in radio. Unregulated radio was actually feared back then. People were terrified it might spread revolution or just cater to the absolute lowest tastes. So to prevent that, the BBC was strictly controlled. The general manager, Lord John Reith, had this very rigid vision. He famously argued radio's true purpose was to inform, educate, and entertain, and strictly in that exact order. As he bluntly put it in 1924, to have exploited so great a scientific invention for the purpose and pursuit of entertainment alone would have been a prostitution of its powers. Let's pause and break down that really intense language for a second. By prostitution of its powers, Reith meant the corrupt or unworthy use of a highly valuable tool or ability for low-minded goals. Basically, he felt that using radio just for cheap thrills would be a massive insult to the character and intelligence of the British public. He firmly believed it was always better to overestimate the mentality of the public rather than underestimate it.
Reith took this mandate so seriously that the BBC wouldn't even broadcast before 12:30 p.m. on Sundays. Why? To make sure people actually went to church. And the rest of Sunday programming? Strictly religious services and classical music. Yet, despite these incredibly serious, rigorous schedules, radio adoption completely skyrocketed. We're talking a jump from a mere 36,000 licenses in 1922 to 2 million by 1926, and over 8 million by the late 1930s. People were hooked.
Which brings us to Section 4, Impartiality in a National Crisis. As radio transformed into this national powerhouse, Reith found himself fighting a desperate battle with the post office, the guys who issued their license. He wanted the BBC to cover controversial political subjects that were entirely banned from the airwaves. He argued passionately for this, writing that audiences practically never have an opportunity of hearing all sides of a question from the lips of the exponents of them. He felt everyday people were just absorbing whatever biased views were handed down by the partisan press or their own political parties. And just to clarify, that word exponents, Reith simply meant the actual politicians, thinkers, and people who actively support, promote, and explain a particular political stance. He believed the public absolutely deserved to hear directly from the source, from all sides of the political spectrum. He wanted radio to act as a truly valuable, enlightening national service. This represents a massive, game-changing shift in media consumption. Think about it. On one hand, you've got the highly partisan print media, aggressively pushing specific party views and biases. But on the other hand, you have BBC Radio, striving under Reith's mission to offer a strictly objective platform. The BBC wasn't taking sides at all. It was carving out a neutral space for every side to be heard impartially. Now, this fierce commitment to neutrality was severely tested during the 1926 general strike. Ordinary means of communication were totally suspended. Suddenly, the BBC, working alongside Reuters, became the absolute sole lifeline for objective information. On May 4th, 1926, their morning bulletin announced they'd handle this responsibility in the most impartial spirit possible, making the point that nothing is more likely to create a panic than the complete interruption of authentic news.
And in this high-stakes context, authentic means genuine, reliable, and grounded in plain objective facts, rather than wild runaway rumors. Providing this unbiased, factual news was deemed absolutely essential by the BBC to stop public panic and dangerous misinformation from taking over during a major national emergency. They basically asked the public for fair play in exchange for their tradition of fairness. Finally, let's look at Section 5, Shaping a New National Culture. It's fascinating how radio transformed from this feared potential source of revolution into the very glue holding British society together. The BBC actively reinforced a unified national culture by broadcasting massive shared live events. Just imagine it, millions of people across the country tuning in simultaneously to annual sporting events, solemn Remembrance Day services, or the very first broadcast of Christmas carols from King's College in 1928. It brought the entire nation together in real time, strengthening traditional values while exposing everyday people to a much wider world of ideas. Ultimately, the media diet consumed back in the 1920s literally laid the foundation for the structures we still rely on today. From the highly segmented weekly magazines and that visual, Americanized escapism of cinema, all the way to the foundational concept of an impartial, live national broadcaster, the 1920s quite literally created the modern mass media world we're living in right now.
Which leaves us with a final, really important thought to ponder. Looking back at Lord John Reith's original, noble mission for the BBC, this idea that media shouldn't just be a prostitution of its powers, but should actively elevate the public, we really have to ask ourselves a critical question. When you look at the mass media landscape we consume today, does it inform, educate, or does it just entertain? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you some great food for thought.